Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf kafchet. Today's daf is sponsored by Terry Rosh and Rabbi Chaim Herring in honor of the birthday of their dear friend Dvora Lopez. Thank you for joining us on our daf journey. Wishing you many more years filled with joy and happiness. Today's daf is sponsored by Hadron Women of Long Island in honor of the birth of Tamar Chanat, to our friend and co-learner Marcy and Jonathan Farrell on the second day of Sukkot. May Tamar, born on Zman Simchatenu, be a source of simcha and nachat to you and the Jewish nation as you raise her l'Torah, l'chuppah, u'masim tovim. Mazal tov. Today's daf is sponsored by Bili Mislatsky in loving memory of Rivka Bat, Tina, and Yitzchak Tzvi, her sister. Okay, we're going to get started. A quick message, which is that the dapim for tomorrow, Hoshana Rabbah, and for Shmini Atzeret are going up after class this morning, so you'll be able to learn them in advance if you would like. On Wednesday, which I know is Chag and Chutz La'aretz, but it will not be in Israel, there'll be regular class as usual. On Wednesday's daf, for those keeping Chag, you will have it accessible after the Chag. Okay, with that, we're going to get started. Today, we're really getting into the topic of pigul, okay, which we've been kind of skirting around and talking about, but now we're going head on into pigul, and today we're going to have two basic sources. One is to explain some line that really doesn't make so much sense in the Mishna or raises questions. In the Mishna we saw yesterday about the hide of the tail, probably a part of the Mishna you didn't really pay so much attention to. I certainly didn't the first time I read it. That's the first sugya. And the second sugya is going to be a very basic sugya about where does it talk about pigul in the Torah, this machshava chutz l'zmano and chutz l'mkomo. And we're going to realize it's not as simple as it seems. Okay, so we're starting off with the Mishnah. The Mishnah had mentioned that we saw at the end of yesterday's daf. If you're slaughtering a zevach, okay, you're slaughtering a korban, lizrok demo b'chutz, or miktzat demo b'chutz, in order with the intent that you're going to sprinkle the blood outside the area. And then the second part of the Mishnah talked about outside the frame, the time frame that you're allowed to. So again, there's either outside the space or outside of time. Or, so there's either the blood or laktir, a thought about laktir umuim b'chutz. You're going to burn the parts on the altar outside, or some of them, okay? Or to eat the meat. There's three actions. We're going to see the Rosh for this at the very end of today's daf. It all has to do with some eating. We talked about this, eating on the altar or eating by people. So eating on the altar could be the blood on the altar, or the parts of the meat that get burnt on the altar, the parts of the animal, or eating the meat by humans, okay? Any kind of thought. Now again, it has to be a thought during one of the four main avodot, shchita, kabbalah, holacha, and zrika, about either I'll sprinkle the blood outside the wrong time or outside the wrong place, outside the right place, or I'll burn the parts, or someone will burn them in the wrong time, in the wrong place, or someone will eat them in the wrong time, in the wrong place. Any kind of thought about this. Okay, we haven't yet gotten to the big basic machlokes, who's having the thought, the kohen, or the person who owns the sacrifice. Okay, that's another issue that we'll talk about later. But there's a thought that basically, the wrong thought, that disqualifies the korban in both those cases. Chutz l'mkomo, chutz l'zmano. However, what the Mishnah set up was that there's chutz l'mkomo, you're not going to get karet for it. Chutz l'zmano, you are going to get karet. Karet for what? Not for your thought. The karet is for the meat when you eat it. If you, and we're going to see also today, if you finish the korban, meaning you sprinkle the blood on the altar, meaning the korban is brought completely, even though it was disqualified. If you sprinkle the blood on the altar and you finish whatever's supposed to generally happen in a regular korban, and then you go ahead and eat that meat, you will get karet for eating the meat. If it was a chutz l'zmano, outside its time. If it was a chutz l'mkomo thought that messed it up, outside of space, you're not going to get karet for eating it. You can eat the meat. It's forbidden, but you won't get karet for it. We're going to have to figure out, and that's the second part of today's daf, where do we learn that chutz l'mkomo and chutz l'zmano are forbidden, and where do we learn that one gets karet and the other one doesn't, and which is the one that gets karet and which is not, and where is that derived from? We know which one, we know it's chutz l'zmano, but where is that derived from? But the first thing we have to deal with is the part I skipped right now when I was reviewing the Mishnah, which is this line when it started to say about either to sprinkle the blood, or to sprinkle some of the blood, or to burn the parts in the altar, or part of the parts in the altar, outside the right time or space, and and to eat the meat, or either kazayit of it or some of the meat. Oh, here comes the big one, or to eat part of the kazayit. That's an olive bulk, it's a certain measurement of the hide of the tail outside. That's the only specific thing that's specified. It's very strange. Why the hide of the tail? The skin by the tail. Why specifically that? Okay, that's another example brought. So the Gemara says, they start off with, last 3 words of yesterday's daf, Savruha, they thought, this is how they explain the Mishnah, or ha'alya ke'alya dami, that the hide of the tail is like the tail. Now, what is this tail? Well, it must be the tail that's discussed in the Torah that has a unique halacha, which is the tail of a sheep. It's a very fatty tail, right? The tail of a sheep, you've seen it, right? It's a short, fatty tail. That tail of a sheep only needs to be burned on the altar. So now they're going to say, we assume we're talking about that, because if there's some tail, some aliyah, it's the tail of the sheep, and that gets burned on the altar. Now, the tail gets burned on the altar. What about the hide? So there's going to be 2 different approaches. Is the hide treated like the tail, or is it not treated like the tail? Now, what you need to know is something we're going to see later on in the Gemara. They're going to quote a Mishna in Chulin, where it basically says for different laws, for laws of impurity, normally what becomes impure, what is susceptible to impurity? Food. Okay, but non-edible items are not susceptible to impurity. The hide, okay, the skin of an animal is not food. Okay, and generally people don't eat it. But the hide of this fatty tail is very soft and can be eaten. Because it's very soft and can be eaten, as opposed to like a thick hide that just nobody wants to eat, but this one can be eaten. So therefore, the Mishnah there says that the hide of a tail is treated like the tail for the purposes of impurity, okay? Particularly the one of the sheep, okay? Not the skin by other animals, but specifically the skin next to the tail, okay? Some people explain it's the skin right under the tail. Okay, some skin by the tail. I'm not sure exactly what skin they're referring to, but this is treated like the aliyah for purposes of impurity. And therefore, they assumed here also what it's saying, right? It's that the tail is treated like, the skin of the tail is treated like the tail. Okay, now what's the issue here? Well, that raises a problem with the Mishnah. Why? That would mean that you have to burn the tail of the sheep and you have to burn the hide of the sheep if we treat it the same. Okay, still not a problem. But what does it say in the Mishnah? If you have a thought to burn the parts that get burnt on the altar, the imurim, or to eat the meat that you eat, right? It's going to be pigul. But it also says here to eat a kazayit of the hide. Now, if we treat the hide like the tail, then it gets burnt on the altar. So then, when you have a thought, I'm going to eat it, you're kamechashev me'achila mizbeach la'adam. You're thinking a thought about something that's supposed to be burned on the altar, but your thought has to do with eating it, not burning it on the altar. And it would have been the most intuitive thing, and not only that, we're going to see the next Mishnah says it, that you're only obligated if you have a thought about eating something that normally gets eaten and burning something that normally gets burnt. So if we assume that the tail of the hide is like the hide, the hide of the tail is like the tail, then it would get burnt on the altar. And then if you had a thought to eat it beyond its designated time or to burn it beyond, to eat it beyond its designated place, right, outside its designated place, it shouldn't be pigul. Because, and that's the question here, your mechashev, your thought is from something that's supposed to be burned on the altar, but the thought is la'adam, about the person eating it. That usually doesn't make it pigul. So we're going to have 3 answers to this question. Amar Shmuel, okay, just to tell you, 2 are going to keep this approach that it's the same, and 1 is going to say, oh no, the hide is not treated like the tail. Okay, and therefore that resolves the problem, because then the hide actually can get eaten, and it's like food, and that fits perfectly, right? That, in other words, you can actually eat it; it doesn't get burned. Okay, so we'll talk about that. So Amar Shmuel, Hamane, Rabbi Eliezer, he says, oh, that doesn't bother you because that's actually Rabbi Eliezer's shita. Okay, even though I told you generally it's only a thought to burn something that's normally burnt, eat something that's normally eaten. Rabbi Eliezer doesn't think that. Rabbi Eliezer thinks exactly what we just asked. Oh, you can be mechashem me'achila mizbeach la'adam, and that will make a pigul. What does it mean you can? You're not allowed to do any of this pigul thought. But if you did, it's effective. So Amar Shmuel Hamani Rabbi Eliezer, Amar mechashvim me'achila mizbeach la'achila la'adam me'achila la'adam l'chila mizbeach. How do we know this? Okay, he thinks if you have a thought about burning something that's normally eaten or eating something that's normally burnt, that's still pigul. That ruins your korban. Ditnan, as it says in a Mishna in the next chapter. Hashochet et hazevach le'echol davar she'ein darko le'echol. First, we're having Tanakama's opinion, which is the mainstream opinion. If you slaughter a sacrifice with the intent to eat something that isn't normally eaten, or laktir davar she'ein darko laktir, or to burn something that's not normally burned, again, chutz lizman or chutz l'mkomo, they don't bother to tell you. They assume you mean your thought is to do it outside the given time or outside the given place. Kasher. It's fine, because that's not pigul. The Rabbi Eliezer posel, and here you see Rabbi Eliezer's approach, he disqualifies it, okay? So that's a good answer. Except it's not really a good answer, because now the Gemara asks, B'mayu kimtek Rabbi Eliezer, you're going to say Armish is Rabbi Eliezer, as we see Rabbi Eliezer's opinion in the next chapter. Ema seifa, but look at the next Mishna. The next Mishna, which we assume is connected to this one, right? We happen to break it up in the Gemara, but it appears immediately after, says, after we had our Mishnah telling you, pigul, there's chutz l'mkomo, there's chutz l'zmano, this one gets karet, this one doesn't. Now it says, zeh haklal, this is the rule. And you're going to see, this is clearly the rabbi's opinion, not Rabbi Eliezer. And then we're going to say, what, our Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer, and that's the rabbi's? It makes no sense. Kol hashochet v'hamekabel v'hamolich v'hazorek. Notice our Mishnah just talked about slaughtering, just like we started our, I don't know if you remember this, but the first Mishnah in Zevachim was, if you're shochet, shelo lishma. And the next, later on, it said, not only shochet, but also all the other avodot, right? Kabbalah, holacha, and zrika. So same thing here. Kol shochet, v'hamekabel, v'hamolich v'hazorek. If you do one of the four main rituals, le'echol davar shedarko le'echol, u'laktir davar shedarko la'til, to eat something that's normally eaten, or to burn something that's normally burned. What do you see from here? You can infer, right, because it basically says it, davar shedarko le'echol in she'ein darko le'echol lo. It's only something that's normally eaten, but not something that's not normally eaten, but burned. Okay? And Atan Rabbanan, that's the rabbi's shita. So you're going to say, Reisha Rabbi Eliezer, B'Sefer Rabbanan, Armish is Rabbi Eliezer, and all of a sudden it immediately switches to Rabbanan without specifying that this is Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. That's the rabbi's opinion. So, Amar Le'in, Shmuel says, yes, I have no problem with that. And you might remember that we've done this a number of times. Sometimes we say, yeah, we have no choice but to explain it that way. Okay, but we do have a choice because Rav Huna is going to come and explain it differently, and as is Rav Chisda. So Rav Huna Amar, or aliyah lav ka aliyah dami. I told you 2 out of the 3 are going to think what we thought originally, which is the or aliyah is treated like the aliyah and is burned on the altar. Rav Huna answers simply, the or aliyah is not burned on the altar. Okay? It's not like the aliyah. Rava, my tamid Rav Huna. Where does he get this from? Well, what does it say in the Torah? Chilbo ha'aliyah, the chelev, and the aliyah. That's what's burnt. The aliyah itself, the lo or aliyah. It doesn't say in the Torah the skin by the aliyah. Just the aliyah is burnt. Okay? And therefore, there's no question. That's why it says lechol kazayit me or aliyah b'chutz, because that's something that's normally eaten. Okay? It's not burned on the altar. Rav Chisda Amar, by the way, later we're going to get to the obvious question, which is, why didn't that one hold like that one? In other words, what's the problem with each of these shitot that we have to have 3 answers? And by the way, we paskin like Rav Huna, okay? That we don't burn it on the altar, okay? And therefore, if you had a machshavit, right, that's how we read our Mishnah. But Rav Chisda Amar, La'olam or ha'aliyah ki aliyah dami. He goes back like Shmuel, but he's not going to say it's Rabbi Eliezer's approach, because that's not a great approach to say we started with Rabbi Eliezer, we moved to the rabbis. But he says like this, Hacha b'mayaskinan ba'aliyah shel gedi. We made an assumption in the beginning that if the Mishnah said aliyah, it must be the aliyah that we know of, the famous aliyah, which is the tail of the sheep, which is burnt on the altar. But that raised a whole problem. It gets burned. So why is the case you have a thought about eating it? It should be a thought about burning it. And thought about eating it shouldn't be a problem, unless you hold like Rabbi Eliezer. So what does Rav Chisda say? The aliyah mentioned here is the aliyah of a non-sheep. Okay, he says, for example, a gedi, a kid, but whatever it is, it's not a sheep, okay? And the point is, the tail of a baby goat, okay, that would be what the Mishnah is referring to, because that for sure doesn't get burned on the altar. It's only the tail of the sheep that gets burned. Okay, that's Rav Chisda. Now we're going to explain why each one doesn't hold by the other. Kulu k'Shmuel lo amrei. Very easy to say why they didn't agree with Shmuel. Reisha Rabbi Eliezer v'sefer Rabbanan lo mukmei. They preferred not to say what didn't seem very intuitive, that our Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer, the next Mishnah is the rabbis, right, without having specified, oh, this is Rabbi Eliezer, right? It looks like one continuum, and therefore it doesn't make so much sense. Ki Rav Huna lo amrei, because, or al yak al yadami kamash malahu, because Shmuel and Rav Chisda obviously had a tradition that we burn the hide of the aliyah, and therefore couldn't explain it like Rav Huna, because that was the tradition they had. Okay, and it didn't fit with their tradition. Therefore, they didn't want to just say, oh, tradition out the window because of this Mishnah. Okay, so that was the tradition that they had learned. And then they had to figure out how to work it in with the Mishnah. Because again, that's the least intuitive. Ki Rav Chisda, my tamalo amrei. Now, Rav Chisda has a pretty good explanation, but they say, well, why mention the hide of the gedi in this Mishnah? In other words, if the hide of the sheep has a unique halacha, whatever, like we can understand. Like Rav Huna, for example. Since some people think the hide is like the animal and gets burned, therefore they're telling you no, right? According to Rav Huna, they're specifically highlighting the hide by the tail because they want you to know it's not burned, and therefore if you had a thought about eating it, that would be a problem. But if you say it's talking about the hide of the gedi, of the kid, then my kamashalam, what's it trying to teach you? Why add that to the Mishnah here? Or al yad ke al yadami, maybe it wants to teach you that the hide of the al yad, who were sheep, it's to teach you what's not. The hide of the baby goat, if you have a thought about eating it, it's a problem because that gets eaten. To say that the hide of the sheep does not get eaten and it gets burned. And then it's basically coming to teach you that or al yad ke al yadami. But why wouldn't they want to hold like Rav Chisda though? What by this? Because that already appears in a different Mishnah. And I already told you this, that in the Mishnah in Chulin, they already tell you the hide of the tail is like the tail. Okay, now, for purposes of impurity. But that would assume then that it would be the same thing here. And that's why the other commentaries didn't like Rav Chisda, because what's the chiddush of the Mishnah then? That the hide of the goat, yes, the hide of the sheep, no, because the hide of the sheep is like the tail of the sheep, right? The hide of the tail of the sheep is like the tail of the sheep and gets burnt. But we already know that from this Mishnah. Tanina. Ve'elu sha'ol tehem kivsaran. These examples, the hide of them is like their meat, okay? Because their hide is softer, can be eaten. And again, for purpose of impurity, that means if it's food, it's susceptible to impurity. So, or shetachad ha'aliyah, and one of the examples is the hide under the tail. So therefore, we don't need our Mishnah to teach you. And that's why they didn't hold like Rav Chisda. Now, what would Rav Chisda respond to this? Rav Chisda Itzrich, you'd say, no, you do need it. Why? Because what's the obvious? Just because for the purposes of Tumah doesn't necessarily mean for the purposes of sacrifice, it's the same. So Sakadatach, you need it. Why? And you need this Mishnah to tell you also for sacrifices. It's burned. Sakadatach amina hanimilin Tumah derakich mitzaref. That might be only for impurity because it's soft and therefore it's considered, right, it joins together with the tail to be susceptible to impurity. Aval hacha ema lemoshcha ligdula kederach shamalachim ochlim v'lo avidim elachim da'ach lehachi. Here we have a pasuk that says the korbanot are limoshcha. This is in Bamidbar, chapter 18, verse 8. It's saying the korbanot are given limoshcha. Now, what's limoshcha? Okay, it's anoint really, but it's not really to anoint. What the word mishicho? Okay, mishicho is the chosen one, the special one. The korbanot are special, right? They're given to God, so it's ligdula for greatness. So maybe it's only the way kings eat. So maybe, yes, we could say technically the hide by the tail of the sheep is soft and can be eaten. But nobody would bring that on a table for kings. Nobody would serve the king that, so maybe it doesn't get burned on the altar. Because the altar is like serving something to kings. The king of kings. So therefore, you might have thought, Emalo, Kamash Balan. That's why our Mishnah is coming to teach you. Again, how does our Mishnah teach you that? Again, it's a bit long-winded. Our Mishnah says if you have a thought to eat the hide, right, you would think if they really want to teach you this, they would teach it more directly. This is a very indirect way of teaching it. But if you have a thought to eat the hide of a goat outside its time or outside its place, that will be pigul. But what doesn't it say? But not the hide of the sheep, because that won't be pigul, because that doesn't get eaten, that gets burned. Even though you might have thought it doesn't get burned, because it's not so important, it would never go on a table of kings, it actually does get burned. Okay? Because it is treated like the hide, like the tail itself. Okay, that's a convoluted answer, but it is an answer. So now we're going to have a difficulty on Rav Chisda, Meitive. Hashochet et haolah, la'aktir kizayim me'or shetachad al yachutz l'mkomo pasul ve'en bo karet. That's our Mishnah, right? I'm sorry, this isn't our Mishnah. This is different. This is a Braita. If you're shochet, if you slaughter, it's actually a Tosefta. If you slaughter a korban olah, specifically in Ola, notice. Now what's an Ola? Everything gets burnt on the altar. Remember in an Ola, the whole thing gets burnt. If you slaughter an Ola with the intent, Laktir kezayim me'or shetachad al yah chutz limkomo. Here, by the way, it says specifically under. Didn't say under before, but here it says under. If you have a thought to burn a kezayit of the hide that's under the tail, outside its place, pasul ve'en bo karet. Chutz l'zmano pigul v'chayavim alav karet. Okay, so if it's chutz limkomo, it's pasul but no karet. If it's chutz limkomo, outside the place. If it's outside the time, it's going to be pigul and it's karet. Now, the second part isn't so important, but Elazar ben Yehuda ish Habilim omer mishum Rabbi Yaakov v'chenei Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda ish Kfar Ikus omer mishum Rabbi Shimon. They both said in the name of someone else. Echad or beta prasot b'behema daka. Okay, the under the hooves in a small animal, the hide, the skin there. Echad or harosh shel egal arach. Okay, the head of a young calf. Echad or the skin by the head of a young calf. Echad or shetachad al yah, that's our case, so he agrees with Tanakama about that one. V'chol shamanu chachamim legabei tum'ah. Okay, and all that the rabbi said, ve'elu shoroteim kivsaran. Okay, what's that one coming to include? They stopped the Tosefta for a second to say, lavi or shel beit haboshet. That's the or by by the fetus of an animal. Chutz limkomo pasul ve'en bo karet. Chutz zmano pigul v'chayvim alav karet. Now notice what it says here. All these hides are considered like meat. So when you burn the ola, okay, and you burn them, if you haven't thought about the hide, these specific hides, it's like the meat and basically it'll be pigul. Now, what do you notice here though? Ola in aval zevach lo. It's only in a korban ola, but it sounds like it's not in any other korban. Why not in any other korban? Because in any other korban, it gets burned and it doesn't get eaten, right? This is, if you had a thought, one second. If you had a thought, right, to lahaktir, sorry, just said it wrong. If you had a thought lahaktir, any of these, okay, it would be a problem. Now, if you had a thought to eat them, right, it would be a problem because you don't eat the ola. But now they're going to say that's only for an ola though. If you had an intent to burn them in a regular korban, it wouldn't be the case because they don't get burnt, they get eaten. So now we have a problem because remember, what did he say? In the Mishna, it says to eat, right? To eat the aliyah. And he said it's not the aliyah of the keves, right? Because that doesn't get eaten. But here he says it gets eaten, okay? In an ola it doesn't, but in anything else it would get eaten. That's the inference. So they're going to basically explain how Rav Chisda explained this. Well, I'm a Rav Chisda, my area detani ola l'nei zevach, right? According to Rav Chisda, it should say zevach, because according to Rav Chisda again, the aliyah gets burnt, and the or aliyah gets burnt with the aliyah. So if it gets burnt, it should be laktir taliyah, right? The or tachat aliyah, in any korban, not just in ola. Okay, that's a simple way of saying it. To which Amar lacha Rav Chisda could answer one of two possible answers. Just like in our Mishnah, aliyah meant the aliyah of the gdi, of the goat, the baby goat, not the keves. That's what he could say here too, and then it has nothing to do, right? We don't infer anything about the keves, or we would infer what we would write, only the gdi, not the keves. The keves gets burnt on any sacrifice. Or ibayit ema bal yashel ibayit ema tnei zevach. Or just change ola to zevach, and just say, well, it said ola, but it really means edi korban. Okay, so then we don't have an inference, we don't have a difficulty on our list. So what we basically saw was three approaches. Two of them thought that the tail is burnt with the hide under the tail is burnt with the tail. One approach said it's not, okay, and that was the simple way to understand our Mishnah. It gets eaten. If it gets eaten, that's why it says eating the tail, okay? Eating the hide by the tail, eating the hide. The other two had to either explain it like Rabbi Eliezer or say the aliyah actually isn't the aliyah we thought. It's actually talking about a different aliyah, the aliyah of the animal that does get, whose tail even gets eaten, and obviously then the hide could get eaten because again, the hide is soft and is food, is edible, which we learned from Chulin. Okay, that's the first part of our sugya. Now we're going to move to the second part. Pasul ve'en bo karet, okay, which really is just part of the Mishnah that we're referring to. What we really want to learn now, we're going to say, Menani, really, where do we get this from? Where do we get the fact that chutz lizmano, a thought of chutz lizmano, and a thought of chutz limkomo disqualify the korban, and Chutz l'zmano, you'll get karet if you eat the meat, and chutz l'mkomo, you won't. Where do we get all that from? This is going to be quite complicated. For this, we're going to you can look at the chart, okay, in the study guide. I'll share my screen. For this, we're going to first learn the psukim that we're going to darshan, because we're going to have drashot from different psukim, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay, here goes. So the first thing you need to know is Vayikra. Okay, there's two places where it talks about pigul in the Torah. Okay, it doesn't define really what pigul is in a very clear manner. In fact, the simple reading of these psukim is not at all what the rabbis do with them, okay, which is a big question, okay, which they don't actually grapple with. They just grapple with how do we get it from the psukim, but not why did the rabbis take these psukim out of the simple understanding and learn to a psul machshava. Okay, so Vayikra Zayin starts off and it talks about notar. The topic is leaving over meat beyond its designated time. So what's left from the meat on the third day, this is about a shlamim, because a shlamim can be eaten for 2 days, has to be burned. Yud Zayin, this is our big pasuk, and they're going to call it in the Gemara the pasuka aricha, the long pasuk, because it's a long pasuk. Now, this simple reading of this pasuk is, after we just said, if you leave it over to the third day, burn it. If you eat it from your zevach shlamim, right, you eat your korban shlamim on the third day, lo yiratzeh, the korban's disqualified. In other words, it sounds like the simple reading is, if you leave over your meat until day number 3 and then you eat it, it will not be accepted. And the person sacrificing it will not be accepted. It will not be considered for him. Pigul yihiyeh will be called pigul. Okay, pigul seems to be like something disgusting. It's like unacceptable. And the one who eats it will get punished. So this really sounds like they're talking about notar. Okay, if you eat the meat beyond the designated time, you will get punished. That's a real simple reading. Skip to Vayikra Yud Ted. The chit is b'chuz zevach shlamim lasham. They're going to say almost exactly word for word the same thing. If you're sacrificing a korban shlamim, there's some chem tizbechu. Okay, that's not important. That's just the intro. B'yom zivchachem yachel. Okay, eat it on the day of umi machorat and the day after because it's a shlamim. Vanotar yom hashlishi ba'esh yisarev. Same thing. If you leave it over beyond the designated time, you have to burn it. V'im hachol yachel b'yom hashlishi. Same words, right? Pigul hu lo yiratzen. Now here it shortens. Doesn't say hamakrivo tolei chashev lo, okay, but it does say pigulhu and lo yiratzeh, same wording. And then it says ochlav avono yisak kodesh Hashem chilav and nechorta nefesh meha. And then it says, and those who eat it will bear iniquity because kodesh Hashem chilav, that wasn't mentioned before, okay, because God's sanctified, right? Things that are sanctified to God are disgraced. And what wasn't mentioned before either is karet. You get karet. Notice in the first one it says, it didn't say what punishment you get. You're going to bear iniquity, but it didn't say what. In the second time it appears, okay, which is in Parshat Kedoshim, and I'm saying that because the Gemara is going to talk about in Parshat Kedoshim, they're going to relate to it as in that Parsha. Okay, that's Vayikra Yud Tet. It says the punishment karet. Okay, we don't know a lot yet, except the simple reading of this psukim has nothing to do with thoughts, has to do with eating. If you ate it beyond the designated time, the korban is disqualified and you will be punished. And in the second pasuk, it says the punishment is karet in the second section. But the rabbis are going to say, okay, so first we just have this answer which doesn't really make so much sense. Shmuel says, Amar Shmuel, so Manani, Mili, where do we get? We want to find chutz l'zmano, chutz l'mkomo, and that one gets karet, one doesn't. Which one? Okay, that it's chutz l'zmano. In other words, we know the answer. We now want to figure out. We know the facts. We want to figure out where it comes from. So Shmuel says trei krai k'tivei. All he says is it's in 2 psukim. Okay, he doesn't say what 2 psukim. He doesn't say how we learn it from the 2 psukim. And now we're going to try to figure this out. So Mahi, Amar Rabba, and 2 psukim, by the way, can be 2 words in 1 pasuk. Like we don't know really what he says. So we're going to leave Shmuel aside really because now we're going to go into 3 interpretations: Rabba, Abaye, and Rava. Okay, Rava, I'm just going to tell you now, Rabba and Abaye, in the end, there's going to be a difficulty against them, and they're rejected. Okay, that's important to know. And then we're going to have Rava, who we're really only going to start today, and okay, this is going to take us through our daf, this whole thing. I'm a Rabba. Shlishi zeu chutz l'zmano. Pigul zeu chutz l'mkomo. Okay, so he's going to learn all this, okay, the beginning part from the first pasukim. The first pasuk, Yud Zayin. He says, when it says, if you eat it on the third day. Now, you already know the third day from the pasuk before. It says, if you leave it over beyond the third day, it'll be burnt. And if you eat it, you don't need to say on the third day. It's obvious. Lo yiratzeh will not be accepted. Obviously, it's not before that. If you eat it, you're supposed to eat the korban. So, shlishi is chutz lizmano. The fact it says shlishi comes to include a new halacha, which is our halacha of a machshava. You have a thought to eat it beyond the designated time. Pigul, zeu chutzim kamo. And then when it says pigul yiyeh, it's not describing what we already described. It's adding something else is going to be pigul. And what's that? Chutzim kamo. Okay, you can see how this is definitely not what it says in the pasuk, right? But it's a drasha, and that's where they get it from. Okay, in the next stop, we're going to have a question, like, why didn't they just explain it simply? And actually, we're going to see that someone does explain it simply and actually thinks that there is no source in the Torah for the chutzim mano and chutzim kamo. Okay, they say these psukim are actually talking about notar. Okay, but we'll see that outlier opinion tomorrow. So now they say pigul is chutzim kamo, right? Shlishi chutzim mano, pigul chutzim kamo. Okay, that's here on the chart. Pigul in zayin yuchet is chutzim mano. Pigul in zayin yuchet is chutzim kamo. Okay, now, oh, sorry, I wrote yuchet. It's yud zayin. My mistake. Okay, did I write it right? Oh no, I wrote it wrong at the top. It should be Yud Zayin and Yud Chet, not Het Zayin and Yud Zayin. Okay, that was my mistake. Okay, now, now what's left? So now we have to know, why do you only get karet for one and not the other? And why that one and not the other one, okay? Now, then it says, and the soul that eats from it. Now, you could have just said the soul that eats. Why did you have to say mimenu, from it? Obviously from it, what else are you eating? So that word mimenu is unnecessary. It's to teach you, only one gets avono yisa. Okay, one gets the sin, the punishment. Which one? Okay, well, the obvious is, right, it's coming to include chutzim mano, because we know that. That's why it's obvious. And exclude chutzim kamo, to which the Gemara says, but why say that and not that? Why wouldn't you just, if it's going to include one and exclude the other, why it seems a little arbitrary? Why include chutzim mano for punishment and exclude chutzim kamo? Well, it'll be more likely because chutzim mano is the first thing. The shlishi, which relates to time, is chutzim mano. So that would be the first one. So once it's the first one, that would be the one, since we started with it, that must be the one that gets the punishment. To which the Gemara says, Adrabah, chutzim kamo adif tisamachle. But then it says, pigul yihiyeh, and if you eat it, you'll get punished. So wouldn't you think if you eat it is referring to the one just mentioned, that's closer to it? So therefore we reject Rabba. Moving on to Abaye. What Abaye is going to do is say, we learn one from the first set of psukim in Vayikra Zayin and one from Vayikra Yud Tet. Okay, here's Abaye. Amar Abaye, El Amar Abaye. Ki at Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi Amar Rav. This is a bit of a question. Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi would make sense to quote Rav. Anyway, if you quote someone, doesn't quote someone, let's just leave that. Not important right now. Samech adatane tana. Our Mishna that distinguishes between chutzim mano and chutzim kamo, karet yes, not karet that, is based on this bright. Okay, here goes. Right? You didn't need shlishi in Parshat Kedoshim, in Yud Tet, because, right, this whole section in Perek Yud Tet is totally unnecessary. We already learned it in Perek Zayin. Turning out Amabet. So, if Vayikra Yud Tet is unnecessary, well, we're going to do a classic Imeno Inyan L'chutzas Mano T'nei Inyan L'chutzam Kamo. Okay, if it's obviously, if assuming, now this is going to be a big question later, but right now, assuming Vayikra Zayin by Yom HaShlishi is referring to chutzas mano, then when it says by Yom HaShlishi in Vayikra Yud Tet, it must be referring to the other one, chutzim kamo, because we don't need that pasuk to teach you chutzas mano. And now that explains why these two sections are repeated. So here on the chart, right, Shlishi of Zayin Yuchet is chutzas mano, and Shlishi in Parshat Kedoshim is chutzim kamo. Then we still have to figure out how we know only one of them gets karet. Well, mi'et rachmana gabe notal ve'ochlav avono yisa lemi'ute chutzim kamo. Well, okay, now let's get these psukim straight. In Vayikra Yud Tet, pasuk vav is notar, right? If you eat it, right, eat it on that day and the next day. But if you leave it till the third day, you should burn it. Then it says in pasuk zayin, if you eat it by yom hashlishi pigul lo yiratzeh, that we now explained is chutzim kamo. And pasuk chet says ochlav avono yisan. Now ochlav means the ones who eat it. Again, this time it's singular form. that teaches only one of these, is going to get karet. Now, they're going to say now, so again, I'm rereading that sentence. The pasuk specifically limited it to notar, coming to exclude chutzim komo. To which the Gemara says, right, if it's going to be one and not the other, how do you know it's going to be notar that's going to get the punishment and not chutzim komo? Okay, so now this actually is all the way down at the bottom. I put the whole back and forth here because this is like a bit parenthetical. Because this isn't a question on the whole where we learn each one from. That I put in the chart. What's the difficulty with that? But the problem is this ochlav avono yisa. How do you know it's coming to chutzim komo from karet and not notar? So, right, in other words, again, to exclude chutzim komo, it doesn't get karet and notar does. So now they're going to say, maybe you would say, ochlav avono yisa is chutzim komo. And the miute notar mikaret. Maybe it's coming to exclude notar. So they say, mistabra, this is a very weird proof, I'm just warning you. Mistabra notar hava le'ukme bekaret, le'migmar avon chutzas mano dezame le'bezav. They're under an assumption, which we didn't really say inside yet, but there's a gzera shava between avono yisa in Vayikra Yotet, where it says karet, and avonat tisa in Vayikra Zayim, where it didn't say karet. Remember, it didn't say what the punishment was, it just says you're going to have to bear the sin. So they know there's a gzera shava between one and the other. Now, since we know, according to Abaye, Vayikra Zayin is talking about chutz lizmano, outside the given time, well then, right, a machshava, a thought about outside the given time, now we have a problem because, this is going to lead to saying, avono yisa, where we know it's karet, which we're going to make a gzera shava to learn that for chutz lizmano it's karet. It's definitely going to be notar and not chutz limkomo in Kedoshim, the one that we learn the gzera shava from one to the other. We're going to learn it from there because if we're going to have a gzera shava between something and chutz lizmano, it's going to be notar because it's much more similar. How is it much more similar? In other words, we have to say, what's more similar? Notar to chutz lizmano or chutz limkomo to chutz lizmano? So at this stage in the argument, we're going to say, since we have a gzera shava from one to the other, again, this is coming from like after the fact, we know there's a gzera shava, so it must be comparing two similar things. And what are the more similar? Notar and chutz lizmano. Why are they more similar? Tidame lebezav. This is Rashi Tevot for zman. They both relate to time, right? Because one is you're eating it beyond the given time, that's notar. And the second is you're having a thought about eating it beyond the given time or burning it beyond the given time. So that is similar. And bet is bama. When there's heter bamot, which is when there's no Beit HaMikdash, you're allowed to sacrifice on any random altar. You can build an altar anywhere you want. It has no boundaries around it. It doesn't have walls. So there's no issue of chutz limkomo. But there is a problem of chutz lizmano and notar, right? Still a time on every korban. It doesn't matter where you sacrifice it. So they're similar in those two ways. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute. We're trying to figure out which two things are similar. Is notar more similar to chutz lizmano or is chutz limkomo more similar to chutz lizmano? Well, adraba, chutz limkomo, but they look more bekaret. Lemigmar avon lechutz lizmano. And that's, for that price, it would be much smarter to say chutz limkomo, chlav avono yisa pasuk chet in Vayikra Yotet is talking about chutz limkomo, because chutz limkomo is similar to chutz lizmano in 4 ways. It's much more similar. What's mikdash? Okay, I put it down here on your sheet. Mikdash, machshava, ktsat, dam, and shlishi. Both, they're psulei machshava, right? Whereas notar is you're eating it, has nothing to do with your thoughts. Ktsat is if you have a thought about just a little bit of it, you ruin the korban. Blood, they all relate to avodot having to do with the blood, whereas notar is eating the meat, has nothing to do with blood, right? Whereas pigul is only if you have a thought during one of the 4 avodot that have to do with blood. The shchita, kabbalah, halacha, zrika. They all have to do with blood. And shlishi. According to Abaye, they both learned out from the word shlishi. So all the more so, they should be the ones similar, which means the pasuk chet in Perek Yutet should say, ochlav avono yisa. One of these gets punished by karet, right? Which one? Chutz limkomo. And then we learn from there to chutz lizmano. And we know that's not the case, so that doesn't make any sense. So here comes Rabbi Yochanan to fix this up a little bit, and then we'll get to the real problem with Abaye's shita. This isn't yet the real problem. Rabbi Yochanan, Tane Zavdi bar Levi, Zavdi bar Levi brought this bright that says, how do we know pasuk chet here ochlav avono yisa is definitely talking about notar? because it says ki et kodesh Hashem chilel. Ktiv hacha et kodesh at kodesh kodesh. There's a different zera shava. It says kodesh Hashem chilel, and it also says, right, ktiv hacha et kodesh Hashem chilel v'nikrita. Ktiv hatam in Shmot kaftet pasuk lamed daled. It talks about if you leave over from the basar hamiluim and v'sarafta et notar be'esh lo yachel ki kodesh hu. There it talks about notar and it says kodesh. Okay, v'sarafta et notar be'esh v'chule. They don't read the part that says ki kodesh hu. Ma lahalan notar avkan notar. So therefore we know that this pasuk ched is talking about notar from the gzera shava of kodesh. Okay, so that's talking about notar. From there we can learn gzera shava back to chutz lizmano. We seem to be good at this point, right? Again, let's just review. Vayikra Zayin is chutz lizmano. There's a gzera shava there to teach you that it's karet from notar, which is the pasuk ched in Vayikra Yutet, and Vayikra Yutet pasuk Zayin is chutzim kamo, and it's not karet. How do we know? Because it says ochlav avono yisa, only one of these, and in that pasuk, right, it was first mentioned in pasuk vav notar, pasuk Zayin it was chutzim kamo. When it says only one of these, we already proved, since that pasuk is referring to notar, it's notar that's going to get karet and not chutzim kamo. So we think we're okay now. But here comes the question. Okay, now, umay chazit tikra aricha bechutz lizmano ushlishi parsha kadoshim tiyu chutzim kamo. Now they say, wait a minute. The whole premise of Abaye makes no sense. We started off by saying Vayikra Zayin is chutz lizmano and Vayikra Yudchet is Yutet is chutzim kamo. Because right, once we have chutz lizmano, chutzim kamo imeno inyan, right? They both say the same thing, so the second one must be referring to something else. Now, if we say that the first pasuk in Vayikra Zayin is chutz lizmano, and the second pasuk in Vayikra Yutet is chutzim kamo, then we have that whole thing about which one, one of these, the one with the gzera shava, that's the first one, that's chutz lizmano, everything's fine. But who's to say the first one is chutz lizmano and the second is an inyan chutzim kamo? Why don't you say the first time it's mentioned, shlishi is referring to a thought outside its place, and the second time is chutz lizmano, and then you get to the opposite conclusion, which is chalav avono yisa, that's notar. We can learn from there back to the other pasuk of Vayikra Zayin, which is chutzim kamo. So ipuchana, right? You could do the opposite. To which they say, no, mistabra b'chutz lizmano degamar avon avomi notar dedamile b'zav. Again, if we're going to have this gzera shava avono yisa to avonat yisa in Vayikra Zayin, we're going to compare two similar things. And what do we already prove is more similar? Chutz lizmano is more similar. Notar is more similar to chutz lizmano than notar is to chutzim kamo. Because notar is not very similar to chutzim kamo at all. It doesn't have to do with time, not the bama. They have really no similarity, or very few similarities. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute. Because of the gzera shava, we want to compare two similar things. So we're going to say Vayikra Yutet must be notar, and the Vayikra Zayin, which is much more similar to it, is going to be the gzera shava, and it's in Vayikra Parak Zayin. But adraba, aricha b'chutzim kamo, ushlishi kedoshim tiyu b'chutz lizmano, mishum didamile samche v'kamemayile. You could use that same logic to say the exact opposite, which is what? If chutz lizmano is more similar to notar, then chutzim kamo is similar to notar. That everyone agrees with, right? The issue before was what's more similar to chutzim lizmano? Is chutzim kamo more similar, or is notar more similar? But everyone agrees that notar is much more similar to chutzim lizmano than chutzim kamo. So then, why wouldn't you think that in the section that talks about notar here in Vayikra Yutet and karet, maybe we should put the shlishi there is chutz lizmano, because it's much more similar to notar. Put them next to each other there, okay? And then, because it's dame samchele, and then it's saying, even though these are very similar, only one of them is going to get karet. And then you would exclude chutz lizmano for karet, which is not true. So basically, the logic of Abaye fails here, because the whole premise of Abaye was the first pasuk is chutz lizmano, and the second is chutzim kamo, and we basically say there's no reason to say that. Now, the only reason would be to say, because we want to make a gzera shava between two similar things. But theoretically, you could say we want to put them in the same, the psukim right next to each other in pasuk Zayin and Chet. So that doesn't work. So now we're up to Rava, okay? And that's going to be our final answer, but we're not even going to finish Rava today. We're not even going to see the second part, but I'll already tell you. What Rava's going to do right now is he's going to darshan this whole long pasuk, okay? And in the drasha on all different parts of this pasuk, he's going to say everything is really found in this pasuk, and we're going to get to it much later. He's really going to go back to Rabba, who said shlishi is chutz lizmano and pigul is chutz kamo, and it's all learned from that one pasuk. But how he does it and why we had a question on Rabba, and we don't have a question on Rava, and we end with that is the answer, we're going to see tomorrow. Ela Amar Rava. Kulu mikra aricha adyan. It all comes from that one long pasuk. Dichtiv. Hachol yachel. Now here we're going to start darshaning different words of this pasuk. Hachol yachel b'shtei achilot hakatuv medaber. Echad achila adam, echad achila mizbeach. This is what we've talked about before a few times. Pigul is on a thought about having to do with consumption. Consumption could be consumption on the altar, consumption by a human. So it's a thought that has to do with either blood on the altar, burning parts on the altar, or eating parts of the meat. Mibasar zevach shlamav. What do we learn from those next words? Mibasar zevach shlamav. Okay, I'm highlighting here on the sheet. Mashlamim mifaglim umitpaglim. Afkol mifaglim umitpaglim. Pigul is only going to be relevant to something that's like a shlamim in the sense that there's mifaglim and mitpaglim. What does that mean? There's a matir and there's something that becomes mutar. There's something that permits something and then there's something that becomes permitted. That's the mifaglim. There's the matir, it causes it to be pigul, and then there's mitpaglim, it becomes pigul, meaning it becomes, okay, there's shchita, kabbalah, and holacha, which permit, without those, you can't, they're called matirim. They're not actually actions of something that you're doing that's the end game. It's a permitting the blood to be sprinkled. And those four together permit the parts to be burnt on the altar and permit the meat to be eaten. If you didn't have those four actions, you wouldn't be able to burn the meat on the altar. You wouldn't be able. So that's the mifaglim and mitpaglim. Same with the mincha. You take the kmitza. When you take the kmitza, that permits that part to be burnt on the altar, and then it permits the rest of it to be eaten. Those are shiraim the kohanim can eat. So all those are going to have pigul because there's the part that permits it and the part that becomes permitted. But in a mincha of the kohen gadol, which he brings every day, the mincha chavitin, or the mincha of a kohen who just brings a voluntary mincha offering, there's no kometz. We don't take anything out. We just make a dough and we burn the whole thing on the altar. So there's no action. That's the matir. So there's going to be no pigul in that whole thing because you're missing the important, the matirim. Okay, that's another halacha. Shlishi, here, ding, 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 this is what we're looking for. Shlishi is a chutz lizmano, and I'll already tell you now because we're not going to see it till tomorrow. Pigul, in that pasuk, pigul yiyeh is going to be chutz limkamo. Okay, we're here now. Rava says, Shlishi is chutz lizmano, and pigul yiyeh is chutz limkamo. It all is learned from that one pasuk. But we're going to have a few more things, drasho, for today, and then we'll stop. Lo yiratzeh, kartzap kasher, ken artzap pasul. Mar artzat kasher, ad shikrivu kol matirav. Again, that matir word. Af artzat pasul, ad shikrivu kol matirav. Since a regular korban cannot be eaten until you until you do all the pre parts, okay? Meaning you can't eat the meat until you do the 4 avodot. Likewise, your meat won't become pigul unless you actually finish. You're not when you do a pigul machshava, the korban is disqualified. If you stop right there, let's say after the slaughtering, you don't do anything else, and you eat the meat, you don't get karet for it. But if you finish the process and sprinkle the blood on the altar, and then the kohen says, by the way, I had a pigul machshava, then since all the matirim happen, those 4 avodot that are critical to allow you to in general eat a meat of the korban, then if you ate the meat of that korban, you would get karet. Hamakriv, right? Hamakriv oto lo yichashev lo. What's hamakriv? Bakrava unifsal ve'eno unifsal b'shlishi. This also is the way they say. It's at the time of the slaughtering, this has to make it a machshava issue, and not when you eat it 3 days later, right? If you eat it on the 3rd day, that's not what the pasuk is talking about, because it says hamakriv, which makes it sound like during the time of the slaughtering, okay? Which means basically during the time you're doing the korban, which is not what the simple reading of the pasuk would have been. When you eat it 3 days later, it's disqualified. Oto, why does it say makriv oto? Obviously it's oto. What's oto coming to say? It's the meat, right? Makriv, the meat, the animal. This is very interesting. Havamina, with this will end. You might have thought that with this, what's disqualified? The kohen is disqualified. And this would be logical, right? If the kohen messes up a korban, maybe the kohen is disqualified for ever doing avoda again. But no, hamakriv oto, it's the oto, the focus is on what was sacrificed. It's the animal that becomes disqualified, not the kohen who did the avoda. Okay, we'll continue along these drashot tomorrow with Rava, and then we're going to see all sorts of other people who have other drashot on this pasuk. It's a big pasuk with open to lots of drashot. So we have 2 basic sugyot today. One is, what was this or ha'aliyah that was mentioned in the Mishna? Why was it mentioned? What is it? It seems to go against what we said otherwise in the Mishna, because it's eating something that normally is burned. Maybe it is burnt, maybe it's not burnt. We had 3 different interpretations. And then we had 3 different interpretations of where we get the chutz zmano and chutz l'kol. Where do we learn at all that they're forbidden. There's a psul machshava, which again is really not the pshat in the psukim. And number 2, how do we know that chutzas mano gets karet and the other one doesn't? Do we learn it from 2 different psukim, from the 2 different sections? In the beginning, actually I didn't mention it's in Parshat Tzav versus the one in Parshat Kedoshim to you. Or do we learn it all? In the end, we have Rava who says, no, we really learned it all from that one pasuk, and now we have to explain to the end how he does it and why we don't have difficulties on him like we have with the others. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day. Modim l'simcha, Shavua Tov, Chag Sameach, because we won't be learning together till after Chag. Okay, our next Zoom class will be on Wednesday. All the other shirim until Wednesday will go up after class today. Have a good day. And b'sorot tovot, b'karov, hopefully.